It was Reagan as a psycho. He killed them all.
It'd be nice to think that gangsters aren't really as bad as they make them out on TV and movies, right? But in this shocking case from London in the UK, one total sicko and his two equally messed up buddies would do the worst thing imaginable. And all just to get some easy money. In mid-February 2003, Neil Chohan, also known as Amajit, was a happily married and very successful London businessman in the freight trade. He had 2 sons with his wife Nancy, and they lived in a really nice home with their grandma, who helped to take care of their little family. Neil Chohan was a good boss too. He ran a successful and very busy freight company, and his workers honestly seemed to like him a lot.
The way of running the company was a relaxed, sort of like happy-go-lucky attitude.
However, Neil was thinking about returning to India and regularly discussed it with his wife Nancy. Then on Thursday morning, right before Valentine's Day, he drove off to meet some investors at a place near StoneHenge.
I'm going off to do a deal and sell the company. He said, and I'll let you know. And that was the last time I saw him.
Nobody really thought much more about it until Monday morning. The freight workers got a huge shock when they learned they had a new boss, and Neil had left for India with his wife and family. At least, that's how it seemed. They got to work and nobody even questioned the change. At least not at first. Nancy's brother lived in New Zealand. Despite that, he was really looking forward to seeing them all again soon.
I was very excited because I was going to see Nancy after 9 years. And it was like a family reunion after a long time.
He used to talk to them every day, but by February 16th, he just couldn't get a hold of his sister or his mom, and that made him really worried.
I thought something's not right.
He contacted the police, and the authorities checked the house. No one answered the door, and neighbors all thought that they'd left for India, but Onkar wasn't convinced. So he flew to the UK to investigate it himself. At the family home in Hounslow, he found a lot of worrying stuff.
As I entered the house, I could see the kids' toys on the floor, the baby feed bottles, all the baby feed and the clothes, they were still in the house. I opened the fridge, there was uncooked food inside.
Of course he was really freaked out. I mean, who just leaves all that if they're leaving the country forever? Even worse, he found his mom's prayer book. She would never have left that behind, as she took it with her everywhere she went. So 3 adults and 2 babies were missing without trace. It wasn't hard for Onkar to get the police involved. And the last person Neil had been in contact with was an ex-con named Kenneth Reagan. But who was this Kenneth guy? Kenneth Reagan was definitely a bit of a character, and that's me being super nice about him.
He was a bit rough, I think. Not well educated, dressed well, nice watch, spent a lot of money. He was kind of like a rich wide boy.
Now, a wide boy is someone who's a bit of a player. And Kenneth liked the good life so much, he was known as Captain Cash. He liked to show off his briefcase full of money. All totally legit, of course. When his freight business came crashing down, thanks to a lot of trading, the police brought him in. He made a deal with the cops that lowered his prison sentence from 20 to just 4 years. But when he was free again, he had no friends on the outside. Well, turning snitch will do that. Even worse, all his money from his illegal dealing had been seized by the authorities. He was broke with no way out. When he got tired of living with his dad in a tiny bungalow, he began to take a major interest in Anil Chohan's freight business. When the cops talked to Kenneth about their meeting, he totally made it sound like Chohan was running away from a big illegal mess of his own. So that was why he'd really disappeared. But the police were really suspicious about that too. It just didn't add up. Now, you may have already seen on many of my other videos on this channel just how technology can catch criminals in a lie. The police pinged 2 cell phones to get Chohan and Kenneth's location on the day he disappeared. They tracked Neil from Hounslow, London, to Wilton in Salisbury. They met here. Then the 2 phones were tracked further south, into Exeter and down to Devon, where a woman named Belinda Brewen lived. And she had a pretty important role to play in this mystery. Belinda Brewen had kind of been stalked by Kenneth right before he went to jail for 4 years. And she'd clearly never been far from his thoughts while he was locked away. When he got out, he offered her a job. Although she had her doubts, she'd fallen on relatively hard times and had very reluctantly started to work for him. She set up an office at his freight business that used to be owned by Chohan. On her very first day, she fell ill and decided to go home early. So she drove back to Devon. When she got back, she saw something totally unexpected on her land.
When I pulled into the drive, I couldn't believe it. There was this old beaten up junkyard, and I thought, what on earth is going on here? And I saw these two guys in my field with a digger.
These two weirdos were a guy called William Hornsney and our old pal, Ken Reagan. They claimed that they were digging Belinda a drainage ditch, but Belinda was furious that they were invading her land like this. They eventually left, and she didn't really think about it again. Not until the police got in touch with her and wanted to visit her at her house. Kenneth acted very strangely when he learned the police were interested in her, but then the cops called off the meeting. They'd traced another lead to Newport in Wales. When the cops went to investigate where they thought Kenneth and Chohan had made up, Belinda got even more visitors. This time, Kenneth and his buddy were joined by another guy, Peter Reese. They were adding gravel to another area near the house. As this area did need some attention, Belinda agreed. As far as Belinda knew, they did what they said they would and left again. Although not before telling her to the cops that he'd been there because of her water system. That sounded super strange to her. And it was only a short time later that the police got back in touch with her. And this time, they wanted to ask her a lot more questions. But would she protect Kenneth and lie to them about what he'd been up to? Despite what Belinda was told by lovely Kenneth, she definitely wasn't crazy enough to lie for him.
And they said, well, what was he doing? And I said, he dug a drainage ditch. And the two of them looked at each other and said, he did what?
So the police began to dig up anywhere on the farm where something or someone could have been buried. They used every forensic tool they had. It was basically CSI UK. They spent 5 days in that field looking for the missing family, but nothing turned up. The police had no idea where to look next. At that point, finding the family looked totally hopeless. But everything would change horribly in April 2003. David and Carl Chapman were enjoying a warm evening out on the water in April 2003. The sea was really calm, and they decided to take their canoes out a lot further than they normally would.
After a short while, I noticed something floating in the sea.
And they'd found something from a nightmare.
You know, as we were sort of just canoeing around looking about, I had noticed something, but I just totally discarded it. It wasn't until he sort of shouted body at me, I was just like, what?
It was clear what it was when they got nearer and could see the feet and upper body floating face down. David sent his son home and stayed with the body until the police arrived.
In the dark for nearly 3 hours. It does get a bit unnerving. You can't ignore a body. Once you find a body, it's there. I can still see the body floating.
Kudos to David for hanging around like that, but his effort meant that the police and the Chohan family had a chance at getting some justice. The autopsy showed that Mr. Chohan had been tied up with plastic tape, beaten, and suffocated. That is so awful. They also looked for proof of where they'd been kept. So the cops headed right back to, you guessed it, Belinda's muddy field.
And we recovered some substantial evidence from that dig site, namely hairs from their burnt clothing, jewellery. Those hairs were subsequently identified as Mr. Chohan's.
With Anil Chohan located, another even worse realization was starting to hit. The workers at his freight factory put it best.
We knew what had happened to Anil, but then our concerns drifted towards Nancy and the kids and the mother.
The police kept searching the huge field, and they discovered some of Nancy's jewelry and even baby clothes in a big bonfire in the same area. The police put this at the highest level of murder inquiry. It was time to get a hold of Kenneth Reagan and his two buddies. They had gone MIA, except for one terrifying encounter with Kenneth and that Hornsey guy, which Belinda managed to bluff her way out of. They'd vanished. Kenneth Reagan and Jack Hornsey had skipped off to Europe, but they'd left their old buddy Peter Reese behind. And he was, let's say, getting pretty twitchy about what the three of them had done. He was staying at a guest house near the Welsh border when he started talking to Wendy Powell's another tenant. And when he started talking, Wendy was beyond shocked.
He just came in, sat down and more or less started pouring his heart out.
He basically confessed that he was involved with a family that had disappeared.
And he just said that he was involved with an Asian family that had disappeared. They could put me at the scene where the bodies were buried, but I didn't kill anybody. It was going, they can't do that. They can't pin that on me.
But what he did pin on Ken Reagan was something even more horrible. Something nobody should be capable of. Wendy was already pretty freaked out by what Peter was telling her at the guest house. Then he confessed something even more horrible about the fate of the Chohan's 2 boys.
Reagan had shot them. It was Reagan. He's a psycho, he said. He killed them all.
Then, the water gave up another secret. Poor Nancy was discovered in the same waters by a fisherman. It was time for the cops to get Kenneth and William out of Europe and put them both on trial. They were charged with the abduction and murder of the Chohan family. A mom, dad, and grandma, and the most awful, their 2 babies. It all came down to over 5,000 pieces of evidence. And do you remember those phones they tracked? Yeah, that was a pretty big deal. And the cell signals put these monsters and Mr. Chohan in the right place at the right time. But even that wouldn't be quite enough to send them down. So what would finally prove what had happened? They'd held Mr. Chohan together at a house in order to make him forge the documents handing over his company. A suitcase full of spare forgeries was handed in by William Hornsey's son, and once they got rid of him, they had to finish off the rest of the family. I can't believe how cold and evil they had to be to do this. Because of how they vanished and how they weren't even recovered until much later, it was impossible to tell exactly when or where, even the forensics at the kidnapper's house. And Reagan had redecorated to hide any evidence too. Detective Chief Inspector Dave Little said, "Kenneth Reagan is the most ruthless man I have ever met. He wiped out an entire family through sheer greed. He was utterly without a conscience, and he showed no remorse." But there still wasn't quite enough proof to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. What could possibly bring these monsters to justice? Inside Anil Chohan's sock, of all places, after 6 months of investigation, the police scientists unpacked it and found a piece of tightly folded paper inside. It was folded up so well that the ink had survived in the seawater. It clearly showed that Mr. Chohan had been held captive at the same address as Kenneth Reagan on February 12, 2003. This last, totally desperate clue from poor Mr. Chohan meant that Peter Reese got 20 years. William Hornsey and Kenneth Reagan got sentences that meant they will never get out, ever. That sentence is not common at all in the UK, but the fact that the police still haven't found the 2 little kids, well, eternal prison sounds more than fair to me. This really reminds me of a lot of other cases I've covered where a family gets murdered for totally selfish reasons, although even then, they're usually related to the killer. While this one was totally for the money. Do you think the missing bodies will ever be found?